Hi everyone. This is a short video on a process known as a cost-benefit analysis. It's sometimes also called cost-effectiveness. So anyway, let's get started. Let me advance the slide here. So why do we consider cost in sort of social work practice? And I just want to pause here before we get into the lecture and give you a minute to kind of think about why cost is important to consider. Most of us have thought at some point in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. I mean, you could think of any number of examples. Renting a house versus buying a house. You could think about the example of the convenience of going out to eat. Versus the cost savings of cooking something at home. You could even do a cost-benefit analysis with respect to graduate school. Is the investment in time and money worth the trade-off of a higher salary in the long run, or is it more important in the short run to be working in the field? So most of us think this way. Or if not about everything, most of us think this way about some things. Today what we're really going to spend time talking about is how cost is sort of an outcome in the context of program evaluation. So just to sort of run through what it is we're gonna talk about today. We'll talk about cost as this idea of as an outcome or an evaluation criteria. We'll go through an example of both cost effectiveness and then a cost benefit analysis. All right. So first of all, in terms of social work practice, let's answer the question: why is cost something we need to consider? Why is it an evaluation criterion? Well, the fact of the matter is that money is a finite resource, and programs really have to balance effectiveness with affordability. Stakeholders are asking themselves really if a program is exorbitantly expensive and only moderately successful, is that worth funding? Now, my sense if we had a truly ideal world, so to speak, is that programs would always be highly effective and cost a very small amount of money. So there would be a real benefit relative to cost. In other words, benefit would outweigh the cost quite substantially. That's not always the case, because sometimes often we work with challenging populations, and there's a substantial amount of cost and effort involved in even modest amounts of outcomes. So as I said a second ago, programs really have to balance effectiveness with affordability. Since so much of the work we do is government funded, the idea behind this is that government has to be accountable to taxpayers and other stakeholders. And the idea is that government has to fund things that are effective or sort of doing right by taxpayers' dollars. The extent to which, we agree or disagree with that is sort of outside the scope of this class. Those are things that you'll talk about in policy courses and other semesters. And it is something important to talk about, but for now we're just going to sort of go with the assumption that we have this sort of duty to report accountability to our stakeholders. So since funding is not always guaranteed, one way to ensure funding from year to year is to sort of demonstrate cost effectiveness. That is to say, value for the dollars invested. And then it also lets agency directors decide on which programs are sort of the most favorable given the outcomes and the costs. Then there's this thing called managed care. Managed care was or is a way to sort of control costs. Really, in managed care, people agree to visit only certain providers, and social workers would be part of that. And the reason they agree to visit only certain providers is that the insurance companies or the payer has negotiated the cost of services with that particular provider, and so it's a way to drive down costs because care is monitored by some kind of external agency, typically the payer. And that's true in social work practice as well, since our field is sort of healthcare adjacent. So at any rate, the point here is that managed care has sort of created cost as an important outcome variable to think about. So, the second thing to think about in terms of why cost is an evaluation criterion is really this idea of efficiency. So are outcomes worth the dollar spent? Are programs effective? And do the benefits outweigh the costs? Now I want to pause here for a second and actually just remind us of where we've talked about benefits outweighing costs before. And that was back in the week where we were talking about research ethics. Remember that beneficence states that the benefits to a particular intervention or study have to outweigh the costs. So it's not as though this is completely unheard of, or this idea of a cost-effectiveness calculation exists only in sort of program evaluation. It's actually it sort of cuts deeper into the way we think about delivering services and conducting research and monitoring practice, things like that. At any rate, moving on here. So in terms of cost effectiveness studies, what they're really useful for is that they help make administrators and stakeholders really in general, they help them make tough decisions about the allocation of resources, particularly when resources are scarce. Resources certainly includes things like physical space and money, program resources and dollars and things like that. But it also includes things like staff time. So it helps to sort of dictate where staff time should be spent as well. And really the hallmark calculation in a cost effectiveness study is to compare the success of a program relative to the cost of a program. So here's an example. There are two programs, and this is actually excuse me, let me just get a drink of water. This is from a paper that Roy Steyer and Paget wrote a couple of years ago. So there's two programs that exist. One is called Job Prep, and the other is called Work Now. And the purpose of both of these programs was to help never employed adults find unemployment. Now, at the time, this language isn't really used anymore, but at the time, this what they were called actually was the hardcore unemployed. And so they were clientele who were particularly vulnerable. They had all dropped out of high school. They were all functionally illiterate. Most of them were in recovery. They almost all of them had criminal records. So this was a group of people who just had extraordinary barriers to finding employment. And so these programs, both Job Prep and Work Now, were sort of intensive, high contact between workers and clients, programs that sort of taught marketable skills and work preparedness and sort of, they placed them with an employer, and then they provided sort of support through, the first couple of months of employment and things like that. So like I said, it was sort of a high contact between worker and client, which of course drove up the cost. Now let me see if I can move my screen real quick. Okay, I'll put myself up in the corner here so that the table on the slide is visible. So what this table tells us is the total program costs, the graduation rate, the number of people employed full-time after a year for both Work Now and then Job Prep. So there's sort of two parallel columns for each of these for each of these different programs. So let's take a look at Work Now real quick. So Work Now, the total program cost was $275,000. Their graduation rate was 64%, and that translates into 48 people who were employed full-time after 1 year. Okay. Job Prep, on the other hand, cost $345,000. Their graduation rate was 40%. So right off the bat, they have a more expensive program, but a lower graduation rate. However, this next row in the chart tells us that 73 people were employed full-time after 1 year. So a little bit of discrepancy in the data here. We'll get into this here in a second. Now, the cost per employed client for Work Now was $5,729. On the other hand, the cost per employed client for Job Prep was $4,726, about $100 less. So what we have to talk about is, how did we arrive at that cost per employed client number? And let's actually do that now. Actually, we'll do that next. So, let's just take a look at a couple of things real quick. So Job Prep costs 20% more in terms of budget. Work Now, on the other hand, had a much higher graduation rate. Its graduation rate was 24% higher. However, Job Prep has a higher employment statistic after 1 year than Work Now does. And their cost per full-time employee is about $1,000 less per graduate. So how do we determine which is more effective here when these data appear conflicting? So we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a second. So here's how we conduct a cost-effectiveness study. The first thing we do is define the program, and actually we've done that in other modules in this class. When we did the logic models, that's really the time in which we're defining programs. And so when programs or stakeholders do cost-effectiveness and cost-benefit analyses, they often, as a sort of early step, will do a logic model, and that's to sort of think about all of the resources and the outcomes and the outputs and the activities and so on and so forth. The resources are all things that sort of cost money. Okay, so define the program, then define the outcome indicators. Again, that's in the logic model, and then compute the costs. So costs are associated with personnel, with facilities, with transportation, with equipment, with all kinds of expenses. Sort of nothing's free in this thing. And then the second step is to collect program outcome data, and that's really in relationship to those operational definitions. More on this in a second. Then we have to compute program outcomes, and what that really means we have to do is translate those outcomes into dollars. So oftentimes when we're looking at computing program outcomes, we're documenting the program's successes and failures, and the best cost-effectiveness studies really use multiple outcome indicators. Then we simply do the calculation. We do the cost-effectiveness ratio. And all that means is that we put the cost on the numerator. So if we're looking at this as a fraction, the cost goes on the numerator side of things. The outcome indicators go on the denominator side of things. So you're dividing the cost by the outcome indicators to get that ratio. Okay, so here's an example of a cost-benefit analysis. This was done on a program. It was a Medicaid program called In-Home Respite. And the purpose of this particular analysis, this is a fairly old one, and it's a little bit oversimplified just for the purposes of the presentation, was to look at the benefit savings relative to the costs of the program. And what they found was that for each dollar spent on in-home respite, the benefit savings to Medicaid was about $3. Now, at no point does a unit of service cost $1. But what you could do is look at things maybe by hour, or by day, or something like that. What they did for this analysis was sort of simplify things so that it was sort of accessible to stakeholders, and in this case, the stakeholders were frankly lawmakers. So they ultimately found the fraction, right? So the fraction was ultimately more complex than 3 divided by 1. It was probably something along the lines of a few $1,000s, which is what it would have cost to send a person in for respite care for a given day or a given week or a given length of time. But the important thing here to think about is what does this ratio look like? So when the benefit is larger than 1, when the calculation is larger than 1, so when that ratio is more than 1, what that tells us is that benefit exceeds costs, and that's what we want. That's what we want it to be, right? So that's sort of consistent with our ethical standards and with the responsibility we have to stakeholders and things like that. If that numerator ends up being smaller than the denominator, so what if in this example, for example, what if we put 50 cents over the dollar, and that over the $1 in cost? So there's 50 cents of benefit for every dollar in cost. What that would mean is that there's only 50 cents of benefit for 50 cents in benefit for every dollar spent, and that would mean that costs are in excess of benefits. So we want to see things larger than 1, and oftentimes we want to see things much larger than 1, so that there's a significant return on the investment. Okay, so let's go back to this work now versus job prep example, and perform the cost-benefit analysis here. So the interesting part about this article was that there was $60,000 in benefit for each program, and that was calculated by the contributions that the employees were making to their respective employers. It was based on their salary. It was based on some other sort of loose calculations about benefit to the economy and things like that. So the first thing we have to do is calculate the benefit. So remember, this is we're dividing the benefit by the cost. So there were 48 people employed, and each of them sort of generated $60,000 worth of benefits in those different ways that I talked about. So the total benefit was just about $2.9 million, 2.88 to be exact. Job prep, on the other hand, had 73 people employed, and each of those people, again, by looking at salary and contributions and things like that, was generating about $60,000 in benefit, and so the total benefit of that program was just under 4.4 million, 4.38 million to be exact. Now, so we have the cost. We have the benefit of each program, and so what we have to do is divide it by the cost. And so, if you remember from a couple of slides ago, the Work Now program cost $275,000. The Job Prep program cost $345,000. So if we divide the benefit by the cost for Work Now, that ratio works out to be 10.42. And if we if we divide the benefit by the cost for Job Prep, we divide that 4.38 million divided by 345,000, and we get a cost benefit ratio of 12.69. So in this case, the higher ratio wins. So the higher ratio is considered the better one, and that would mean that Job Prep has sort of the better cost benefit outcome ratio, or cost benefit ratio. So if we go back here a couple of slides to this cost effectiveness example, on its face, it may look like Job Prep is the lower performing of the two examples. They have a lower graduation rate. They had a higher total program cost. But when we think about sort of all of the benefits, that's where job prep comes out to be the superior program. Now, to be honest, both of these cost-benefit ratios are far in excess of 1. In fact, even what the Work Now program is telling us is that for every dollar invested in the program, you're getting a benefit of $10.42. That's pretty outstanding, and my sense is that a stakeholder would like to fund that. Job prep, on the other hand, what this is telling us is that for every dollar invested, you're seeing a return of $12.69, almost $13. Again, that's also outstanding, and my sense is that most stakeholders would want to fund that. However, if we had to choose, if we were in some hypothetical situation where we had to choose between one of these programs, we had a certain pot of money that we were and we were only going to fund one of these, it's clear that the job prep program is the superior one. So let's just conclude by talking about what cost effectiveness is versus what a cost benefit analysis is. So a cost effectiveness analysis really compares the relative costs against those key outcomes. It looks at sort of the successes compared to those client costs, and it is often used in social services to sort of evaluate the effectiveness of a particular program. A cost benefit analysis, on the other hand, is distinct from a cost effectiveness analysis. However, it is similar. The cost benefit analysis really translates all of those benefits and costs into monetary terms, and so we have to assign some dollar value to certain things, and sometimes those things are sort of difficult to assign a dollar value to. And in fact, there's some ethical concerns about assigning dollar value things to health status indicators or quality of life indicators and things like that. We're not really going to talk about those in this class, but it is something that you should at least be aware of, that assigning dollars to things, especially things that are sort of not typically thought of in terms of dollars and cents, can be difficult to do. I think the thing to remember here is that when you do a cost-benefit analysis, the benefits really need to exceed the costs. And the advantage that I think social workers have in terms of relative to other disciplines in terms of cost-benefit analysis is that when we think about assigning dollars to quality of life indicators or health status indicators and things like that, we would tend to assign quite a bit of value. I mean, I would say that some improvement in quality of life is actually, that benefit would be associated with quite a bit of money. And so I think we're actually in a position to sort of at least participate in those kinds of conversations. There is, if you're interested in this, there was a 2006 issue of Research on Social Work Practice. That's the journal that Bruce Steyer edits, and he's one of the authors on the cost effectiveness example from this lecture, and that's available online. So as always, you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. Thanks for watching.